And today I'm joined by my good friend Charlie Goldberg, and we're going to talk about some really interesting modern artists from kind of early 20th century whose art is pretty exciting and maybe who were people we might not have enjoyed knowing in real life. Is that accurate, Charlie?
Yeah, it is, Rodney. Absolutely.
So we'll get to that.
All right.
Charlie, you've been many times on the show, so welcome back.
Thanks. All right. So we're going to talk about the futurists. I'm just curious how many of you have heard of the futurists. Anyone? No, I see one hand. I can't see the rest of the people. No, I don't see any other hands. Well, good. It'll be something new for you. And I call this a futurists, great art from people you might not like. And there's, pretty good reason why you might not like them. Uh, well, we'll get to it right away, and we'll see. So, is there a way that I can mute that noise when
Yeah,
people are
let me
coming
see if I
in?
can do it, Charlie. The hold on, hold on, I'm trying. That should be off.
Great. Okay, good. So just to have less noise going on in the background. So for people who don't know what futurism is, it started with the poet and writer Filippo Marinetti. And he was a very radical person in the sense that he really wanted this complete rupture from the past. He wanted new artists to be able to get their voice out there. He had a real disgust for anything classical, any sort of academic learning. If you studied at an art academy, he looked down on you. And his sort of call to arms was to destroy the museums and the libraries. And these are his terms: crack syntax, sabotage the adjective, leave nothing but the verb. And he wrote this manifesto, which appeared in Le Figaro in Paris in 1909. And what exactly did they want? They were fascinated with all things related to speed and technology. So these were things like cars, airplanes, and motorcycles, which would have been a big deal at the turn of the 20th century. So they were fascinated with all that new technology. They also wanted war, which is why it's real easy to dislike or dismiss this group of very, very good artists because they saw war as a way to cleanse society of sort of all this dust and debris from the past. They wanted violence, they wanted action. They were a very misogynistic group. You're not going to see uh, any female artists in my presentation today. And there were very few within the group except Marinetti's wife, who was actually a really good muralist. Youth, danger, innovation. And that's what they were all about. And here's a picture of sort of the major players in Futurism: Russolo, Carrà, Marinetti, who was the head, Boccioni, and Severini. And this is really what it's all about. The Who sang, well, a young man, he ain't got nothing in the world these days. And they were sort of the equivalent of that Who mantra. And it really makes sense that this movement would come from Italy. Here's a picture of Rome. It's just, chock-a-block with old important things. Here's a picture of Venice. It's just shoulder to shoulder. There's hardly any room for any growth. And that's the way they felt in the art world, that they were just being completely oppressed by everything that you see. And in fact, I've been in Rome, and you really can't spit without hitting some important monument or work of art. So in 1912, uh, Marinetti goes to cover the siege of Adrianople, which is in Turkey, and it's during the Balkan Wars, and he writes this very important really book of poems called Zang Tum Tum. And I don't know if anyone speaks Italian in the group, but that probably doesn't make sense what Zang Tum Tum means. That's because it's onomatopoeia. That's the sound of bullets hitting the side of something metal. And so within this book, he has all this onomatopoeia. He's using odd fonts and very strange layouts, like you can see here. He was interested in this idea of visual and sonic effects that could be brought about with poetry. And here's just a little self-portrait that he did for The Sketch, which is a magazine that they used to put out. So here's an example of modernist work, but I want to go back to try to figure out how did they get to this type of painting? And believe it or not, it starts with the Impressionists. They really love the Impressionists. Why? Because he really loved the way that they used light. And this is a perfect example of Monet taking the exact same subject at different times of the day or different times of the year so that the light would become different. And they were really fascinated with how he in particular used light. They also love divisionism. Now, this painting by Seurat, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. You might think of the term pointillism, and pointillism was one of the subdivisions of divisionism. And it was sort of based on this idea that if you put certain colors together next to each other, that they would form and congeal to a different color. So if you think about your old television set, how it used to have those little dots, and that, the further away you went, those dots became a clear picture with different colors. So that's pointillism's divisionism. But there was also the divisionism of people like Paul Signac. They weren't using dots, they were using brushstrokes. So here's this portion of this painting, which I've blown up, and you can see how he's putting different strokes of color. And when you look at it very, very quickly, it looks like it's all blue, but in fact, it's divided or divisions of different color that you're seeing. So they really like that idea. They also love the post-impressionists, and in particular Cezanne, because Cezanne is really the father of cubism. He's the one who really started to stretch the bounds of how we look at objects. And this basket of apples is a perfect example. You look at it and at first glance, oh, well, something about it looks weird. For one thing, those apples look like they're about to fall upon us. But if you look at the lines don't really make sense. You're seeing what you think is the edge of the table, but if you follow that line, it now becomes the middle of the table, or the flat portion of the table. So they really like that aspect of Cezanne. And then, of course, they love the Cubists. Now, Rodney, I mean, you're looking here at two Cubist works by the two most famous Cubists, Rock and Picasso. What's lacking from these pictures?
Not a lot of color.
Not a lot of color. So they really liked the idea of cubism, but it didn't really satisfy their aesthetic urges. So they looked at another group of artists called the Orphists. And Orphism is probably a movement that a lot of you don't know about it, but this is Robert Delaunay, the city of Paris. But I really want to point to his wife, Sonia Delaunay, who's a fascinating person. If you ever want to look up a really important woman's biography, look up Sonia Delaunay. A lot of people think that she's the one who came up with the idea of pret-a-porter, like ready-to-wear clothes. Before that, clothes were all made, by hand. And she's the one who came up with this idea of mass production of clothes. But here, as opposed to what we saw in the Cubists, there's lots of color and lots of circular movements. So they were really influenced by the Orphists. So the first futurist that we're going to talk about is Giacomo Balla. And what did he like to show in his works? Speed, movement, and light. He was all about those three factors. He tended to show less violent or less machine imagery than some of the other artists in his cohort. But you'll see that they're really interesting works. He was much older than the rest of the futurists. He was already teaching some of the futurists in his studio. But he was so bought into this idea of speed and the love of modernity that he named his daughter Propeller. So imagine going through school with that first name. But here's one of his most important or most famous pieces called Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. And I think in, 2026 eyes, we look at this and, kind of looks cartoonish more than anything else. But what he's trying to do here is he's trying to capture the idea of movement in an idle painting. How do you do that? And by doing this dog with multiple shots of its feet, he's really relying on two photographers who are doing important work at this time. And the first one was Etienne Jules Marais, a Frenchman who came up with this idea of using a gun. But instead of loading the gun with bullets, he loaded it with film. So that what he would do is he would shoot the gun as someone was moving, and all these images get taken at the same time. Here's a picture of him with the gun on his shoulder, and it really does look like a shotgun that you would use. But this is the type of image that Muybridge, and by the way, these are not misspellings. This is the way he spelled his name. Muybridge did a similar idea. He also wanted to capture multiple images. And so what he did, instead of using a gun that would allow you to take several shots literally at once, he came up with the idea of putting 12 in, let's see, in 4 times 4, 16 in this particular example, 16 cameras with attachments that were like triggers for the shutters of 16 different cameras. And so he came up with this idea of following a horse as it's running. Now, here's one of Bala's works. It's called Swifts, right? And swifts are a type of bird. Paths of movement and dynamic sequences. And this is really a direct nod to the works of Marais and Muybridge. So I'm going to show you here's Marais' view of a bird that's in flight. And you can see how he would have copied that sense of that little dog running using this photo. Well, here it is with birds in flight. And when you put the painting of the swifts, the birds, next to the photograph of the birds, you can see how he's trying to get these undulating movements. But what's interesting is if you look at this painting a little bit, it might remind you, I mean, here's this group of futurists that wanted to deny anything that's in the past. But in fact, when you look at Velázquez's The Surrender of Breda, you see sort of these similar, you see these pikes and flags that are raised here. And you can, people have looked at this old painting and said, boy, that's really like a modern remake of the painting on the right. So it's interesting that these guys, you can't help what your brain has stored visually. None of us are completely bereft of visual memories. And so it's really interesting that he would come up with this idea of Breda in the back of his mind. So here's another one. This one's called Girl Running on a Balcony. It's a lot like that dog that we see, where you see these multiple images. And you can see the same idea that Marais and Muybridge were doing. You could almost imagine this being a photograph taken by Muybridge that had sequential images of this girl that's running. Why am I not getting? There we go. Then he does this work called Streetlight, which I think is really, really fascinating. I particularly like this work. And I put this quote up by Marinetti, "Let's kill the moonlight." Why? Because the moonlight is sort of associated with all these sentimental moments in art, in song, in literature. You kiss under the moon, you do these, sort of romantic notions on the moon. That's not what Marinetti was all about. He wanted to get rid of all those sentimental norms. So if you look at this picture, we have the moon, but it's really being outshone by what? By this new modern equipment, electric lights instead of gas lights, which wouldn't have been as bright. And this is just a detail of it. And I want you to think about what I said about divisionism and Signac and how Signac used these different brushstrokes next to each other, different colors next to each other to create these kinds of effects. Let me go back to the painting from a distance, then look at the close-up and you can see the type of work that he's doing there. All right. So, Rodney, I'm going to ask you now. So, here's a title that I think is curious. We're looking at a painting, a static object. And yet, the title of this is what?
So abstract of speed and sound. So you get the real sense of movement.
Yep.
And the question is, do you get a real sense of sound? Um, I don't know. I don't know that I get that.
Well, what he's trying to evoke is he's trying to evoke this idea of sound. And what that's called is synesthesia. And this is sort of the best definition I saw of synesthesia, which is the production of sense impression relating to one sense or part of the body by stimulation of another sense or part of that body. And what does that mean? So if I said to you something like, love is blue, 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 my love is blue, you're taking an emotion and turning it into a color. So you're taking one sense and turning it into a different sense. So for some people, like this example that we have on the right, numbers can have associated colors. My wife has a little bit of synesthesia, and it has to do with this idea of associating numbers with colors. Or music can invoke colors. You know, if you think of the movie Fantasia, Fantasia is really all about synesthesia. He's taking music, right? Walt Disney, taking music and putting visual images to it. You know, for some people, words have taste, and there's a lot of people that have synesthesia. Joni Mitchell, Nikola Tesla, Nabokov, Richard Feynman, who's a physicist, Sibelius and Wagner, both composers who have it. And what's interesting is that creative people tend to have a much higher rate of synesthesia than people in the regular population. So as opposed to somewhere between 1 and 4% of just people that you'd see on the street, 24%, almost 1 in 4 would have synesthesia among people who have creative occupations. So it's kind of an interesting idea. So, you know, that's what he's trying to do when he calls this, you know, dynamic of speed and sound. He's trying to get us to evoke sound. You know, with these brushstrokes, you know, so it's a really curious idea. And there's no evidence that he had synesthesia. I've tried to look that up, and you know, but he's still trying to evoke the idea of synesthesia. So, you know, what he wants is when you approach this painting, he wants you to hear it as well as to see it. So it's an interesting piece from that perspective, and you can see all the movement. Look at the very bold reds that he's using here. You know, this is not a subtle or timid piece. This is a nice piece called Rhythm of the Violinist, and his friend was a professional violinist. And he wanted to just try to capture the idea of his friend's hand movements while he was playing the violin. So it's almost as though we're looking at, again, one of Marais or Muybridge's photographs, where you're seeing multiple images of the same action going on. So here it's less that he's evoking the sound of the violin. Here he's trying to evoke the movement of a violin on a static piece. And then I just wanted to show just an example of some of his sculpture as well. Here, he's calling this piece Boccioni's Fist Lines of Force. Boccioni is the next artist that we're going to talk about, but also just these very powerful movement images that he's doing in his architecture. So here's Umberto Boccioni, and he had an early friendship with Severini, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, and they had sort of a mutual interest in Nietzsche and rebellion, and so they became both friends with each other, and then they both became students of Giacomo Balla, the artist that we just looked at. And he moved to Paris in 1906 and ended up studying those impressionist and post-impressionist styles that I showed you in those first few examples. And in 1910, he meets Marinetti, the poet and sort of instigator of this movement. And you know, he took it very, very seriously. When World War One started, he signed up for World War One, and unfortunately, he got trampled by a horse during one of their training exercises for World War One. Um, so this is one of his pieces. It's one of his most famous pieces. It's called The City Rises that he did in 1910. And it's a really, I find it artistically brilliant. I mean, you see lots and lots of movement. Um, you know, Rodney, what do you see in the center of this piece?
Well, it's this horse, and
Yeah.
it's just like in movement. And there's another horse that it's kind of going up against. You see people kind of moving around. Yeah, it's kind of hypnotic.
Yeah, it really is. And you can really see all the sort of different lines which get your eyes to move in different ways. You know, and I probably said this before in one of our talks. You know, if you want to do a calm, peaceful work, you have very direct verticals, very direct horizontals. If you want to show chaos and movement, you use horizontal diagonals. And this painting is really filled with diagonals, including probably the largest diagonal being this line that cuts through from one end of the painting to another. So you really see a lot of force, a lot of movement, a lot of action, and that's exactly what he wanted. And what was going on is this takes place in Milan, and Milan is building a new power station, a new electric power station. So here's this sort of contrast between, what are they doing the work with? They're doing the work with animals that people have used for centuries and millennia to help with their work. And yet you've got a new power station going on. So he's really trying to show how the contrast between the old and the new. And if you look
So
at this,
there's a question from Gail. Do the horses have wings, or are they riders on the horses?
I think that's a saddle that we're looking at. But I don't think they're meant to have wings. I think he's not trying to, create a sort of, a nod towards, what's a flying horse? I can't remember the name of the flying horse. I can't, but you know what I'm talking about from
Yeah,
mythology.
it's supposed to be
Pegasus.
realistic. Pegasus. There it
Pegasus,
is.
thank you. Pegasus is the word I
Yes.
was looking for. No, it's not meant to evoke that at all. These are real horses. I'm not convinced that there's a rider because you see something this sort of a similar thing, but I'm not sure. Certainly could be a rider. Um, uh, at any rate, here's a close-up, and you can see the brushstrokes. The brushstrokes are really active and powerful. He's really trying to get a lot of strength and movement. This is not a Monet piece. This is not, something, this is not Vermeer, for example, who's doing these really, really careful brushstrokes. These are rapid strokes that are meant to evoke action. And here's a theme that he would have loved, right? Riot in the Galleria. And you can see all this action. And again, look at the diagonal lines that go through this. You see the very direct vertical lines the Galleria in the background. Everything's very, very straight and orderly. And then everything down here, including this very strong diagonal all across this painting, is showing action and movement. And if you really look at this painting closely, I'm going to blow this up just a little bit so you see what I'm talking about. So I have Seurat, right, who's doing pointillism. So look at the way Seurat handles this wall right here. Look at the way that Boccioni is doing this wall here. That could very easily have been painted by Seurat as well. At least that portion of the painting. And then of course, Seurat is showing its own chaos of a circus in this particular painting. And this is just a detail. What's at the center of this riot that's at the Galleria? It's two women fighting. So, there's all this ado going on. There's just kind of chaos. And so he really loved those types of actions in his painting. Here's another one. And I love this title more than anything else. The street enters the house. What do you think of when you hear that title, Rodney?
Street enters the house. It's kind of like they should be totally separate things,
Yeah.
and somehow it's things are kind of so extreme that now you can't keep them separate.
Right. I like this idea that that it is coming towards us. Normally you walk out onto your balcony if you have a balcony and you're looking out. The movement is outward. Here, the movement is inward. It's bringing you inward. And so, here's this very, very cubist influenced piece. But yet, if you look at those colors that Robert and Sonia Delaunay were using in their paintings, you get a sense of the Orphism at the same time. And you get this kind of swirl. There's like almost like this whirling eddy that's going on within this painting that really takes us in. And I hope everyone can appreciate that this is a woman leaning on her balcony right here, And here you do get a sense, this almost looks like a flying horse right here. You see that? So there's just all kinds of craziness that's going on in this
Yeah,
painting.
Gail has a comment. What's going on outside can't be kept out of our home.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's literally coming into our home. At least that's what he's hoping you'll see in this painting. So I think this is a really fascinating work of art. And this is just a close-up detail. And, again, look at how he gets these little textures within her uh, coat. I guess she's wearing something like that. It's just it's really beautifully done. And then, you see this very old style. This is a kind of railing that you might see in France, in Paris, for example. And there's a painting by Kaibot, which shows a railing that's very, very similar to that. And then you can see a neighbor also looking out and seeing the action. You can see people climbing up everywhere. It's a really chaotic painting. Then he does this one, Dynamism of a Cyclist. And I think this is just a really beautiful painting because of his use of different colors. For me, my eye tends to go directly to the red, so the red immediately pops out at me, and then I see all these greens, and this idea of using red against green, the primary colors being what's the word I'm thinking of? Not primary colors, but opposing colors, will often bring out your brain will actually start to vibrate when they have this, and then he's got lots of blues and yellows and purples and lots of other colors. But, I don't know, Rodney, do you see a cyclist in here?
Not really. That it's interesting for me since I am a cyclist.
Right.
But you're cycling and you're lots going on. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, so maybe one arm here, the other arm here. Here's the head of the cyclist, and they're sort of leaning forward. But what I wanted to show you was some of the preparatory drawings that he did for this. And I think the order of the drawings that he did, I don't know for sure because I couldn't get dates on these drawings, but I think this is the one he did first, this is the one he did second, and this is the one he did third, and then eventually that becomes this. And so these are gestural drawings. If you've ever taken a drawing class, uh, typically a teacher will tell you to do just, try to get the movement, try to get the feeling of something rather than actually trying to get it as clear as possible. So here, in this particular drawing, I think we can see pretty clearly that there's a cyclist that's racing along. You get a hint of a helmet here. You get the hint of a cyclist bent over like that. You can see the cycle. Then it becomes more and more abstract as he starts to play with these lines of energy and force. And, so this one, you look at this one, you go, well, gosh, is there a cyclist? I mean, to me, it almost looks like there's a horse like this, horse's neck, horse's hoof, you're not sure that you're looking at that. And then he adds color to it. And it becomes just this idea of energy, of movement, of speed, velocity. These are the things that futurists are trying to accomplish in their paintings. And I just wanted to show, actually, I'm going to show you two of Boccioni's um, sculpture works. This is his most famous. It's called Single Line in Spatial Continuity. And again, how do you get movement out of a static object? So he's getting these it's almost as though if you were in a pool and had dye coming out of your legs and you showed the movement of your legs through the water. That's really what he's trying to show in a static statue. But what's interesting, again, is this insistence on getting rid of the past, but they can't help but look at the past. Lots of art historians have looked at Boccioni's piece on the right, and they look at Winged Victory on the left. And then, here's a quote: "A roaring automobile is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace," and that's what this piece is called. It's known as Winged Victory, but it's the victory of Samothrace. So Marinetti is using this exact example. And yet, when you look at this statue by Boccioni, he's really leaning on the sort of general look, general appearance of the very thing that Marinelli is talking against or as opposed to. Any thoughts about this sort of connection, Rodney? Do you buy it?
I think what really interests me is that there's like this process that goes into coming up with these artworks. That it's like one thing kind of leads to another. Like we had that with a cyclist where You end up with an image that's pretty hard to decipher. But then when you go back to the steps that led to it, it makes more sense.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's true for the sculpture also, that you have to think about what went into what led to it.
Yeah.
He isn't just trying to recreate something that exists in our world.
Yeah, and I've seen this work, this sculpture. It's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I found it thrilling. First of all, it wasn't meant to be in this cast bronze. He died before it could be cast, so it's original. As Boccioni saw it, it was just, sort of plaster. So for him, it was really all about just the movement. Later on, it gets cast in bronze, and you see the final product of what we have here on the right. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is really powerful stuff. It's really interesting, the movement of it, the rhythm, the flow of it. How do you create movement or flow? Well, you look at Winning Victory here, and this artist was able to get this sense, like this, half woman, half angel could certainly fly off the deck of a ship. I mean, you really get that sense of movement within this piece. And, Boccioni is trying to even accelerate or accentuate how much movement he can get out of a static object. It's really, I find it very fascinating.
It looks to me like it's going to walk or run in some really dynamic way.
Yeah,
Do you,
I
do you
mean,
get? Yeah. Is that the sense that you get of its movement?
oh, it's like the $6 Million Man, if you remember the commercial, right?
Right.
Not the commercial, but the opening.
Steve Austin.
Right. I mean, you could almost see that as as the $6 Million Man, but done in the early 1900s. We're actually going to look at two more of his statue sculptures because I think they're really interesting. And this is a work that he did of his mother. It's called Anti-Graceful. Now, he's not meaning that his mother is not graceful. He's really working on the idea that grace is a thing of the past, that we need to get rid of that, that's, how the old artists thought, how do I create grace? Instead, they're trying to create movement. So we see this, uh, you know, almost grotesque image of his mother. You can clearly make out her features, and her features are not grotesque, but the way that they're presented does have, like, here's this movement here, and then it cuts up like that. It's a really unusual thing. And then he has this sitting behind her head. What is that? We can't really make what that is. Almost like she has a basket of fruit on top of her head. It's a really interesting piece. And I wanted to just compare it to Picasso's Head of a Woman. And Boccioni would have seen this work by Picasso, and I think he was really influenced by what Picasso was trying to do. Again, Picasso, being a cubist, was interested in, how do you put all these different elements of something that you're looking at, it back in different angles or in different orders or not in the sort of planes that you would expect. Like, look at how Picasso puts this jawline, right? Well, our jaws and our cheeks don't come out the way they do, but he's a cubist. He's allowed to play with those planes and kind of adjust them and distort them, if you will. And you can see how Boccioni is clearly doing that with this bust of his mother as well. So it's kind of an interesting work. This is the last one I'm going to show you, Boccioni, and this is called Development of a Bottle in Space. And you look at this, and again, I always try to get at least two views of a sculpture because if I showed you the piece on the left, you'd say, oh, yeah, that looks exactly like a Cubist painting. That looks like something Braque and Picasso would have done in the studio. But when you look at it from different angles, you see that he's very deliberately trying to manipulate how space works so that, we look at the one on the left and clearly we can see the form of a bottle. But we're not really sure what else we're looking at. Like, what is this? It's as though the bottle is in half of a saucer or something like that. And what are these lines? What do they represent? at least to me, it almost looks like you can imagine a potter's wheel and someone working something on a potter's wheel, and maybe something as it's spinning is flying off. He's trying to think about the process of how you make a bottle. Now, of course, bottles are not made with a spinning wheel, really, right? But you can sort of think about that process of what's going on and how do you create something that becomes spherical and bottle shaped. So it's a really interesting piece in my mind. I've never seen this piece, but I'd really like to.
I've got a question, Charlie.
Yeah,
So this fascination with like how a bottle is made, and with like the light, you know, against the moon, is this really tied to the fact that this is all new technology, that their world is changing and industrializing, and this is a reaction to that?
100%. You think about 20 years before, you think about the 1890s. There were gas lamps. There were no electric lamps at that point. There were horses and carriages. There were not cars. There were not motorcycles. There were not airplanes. Things were made by hand. You didn't have, I guess there were some examples of manufacturing, but not many. And so they really are starting to embrace what they're seeing as new in their century. And they want that to be the model for what we should be looking at art. When we look at art, we should be looking at these new developments. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Like we have to try to look at these things through their eyes and
Right.
not through our 21st century eyes.
Right. So to us, we've gone through modernism as an art form. Most of us are used to looking at this and not being shocked or horrified or disgusted by what we're looking. That's because we've seen Picasso a million times. We've seen Braque a million times. We've seen all these other futuristic movements. We've seen, abstract expressionism. Well, compared to abstract expressionism, this is a, piece of cake to figure out what's going on here. You know what I'm saying? So I think, you have to always put yourself in the mind of the viewer in 1912. And if you were living in Paris, okay, you had seen Braque, you had seen Picasso, you had seen some of the other modernist painters working. If you grew up on a farm in Iowa, you would not have seen work like this. And it would have been really shocking for you. It would have been certainly a turn of the new. Or, to quote Robert, what's his last name? Really important art book called Shock of the New.
Yeah.
That this is what this is. I can't think of his last name, but really great writer. All right, so Corot is the next painter that we're going to talk about. And he was actually living in Paris during the 1900 Universal Exposition. And it was a real showcase for things like Art Nouveau. And so he learned French, he was working there. And for him, he was also interested in that idea of synesthesia in art. Again, there's no evidence that he was a synesthetic, but he was interested in that idea. And in 1913, he writes a manifesto called The Painting of Sounds, Noises, and Smells. So it's a really interesting concept where he's deliberately getting us to think about synesthesia. He's trying to have us include these other senses within our appreciation of a work of art. And I think this is a great example of what he's talking about. So here, interventionist demonstration, patriotic holiday, free word painting, and this should make you think of Marinetti, right? Here's Marinetti who creates a book of poetry, really really radical with the way it's typeset and the fonts that he's using and his movement. And here, this is what he's trying to recreate. He's trying to recreate Marinetti's painting in a work that's really abstract. And if you look at this really carefully, this is a collage. And, who were the first to really use collage? They were the Cubists. The first time you saw a word in a painting was with Picasso, where they literally put down other types of material. One of his paintings has a kind of like a raffia material that's pasted onto the painting. Well, if you look at this, he's got a mirror here, he's got all these words here, and I'm just going to show you just as a comparison. On the right is Marinetti's book of poems, and I showed you how he's using that. And you can see how Corot is trying to recreate that same idea with this visual work. Um, then he has this work called The Funeral of the Anarchist Gali. Gali was, as it says here, an anarchist, and when he died, many Italian anarchists came to the funeral, which was then broken up, whoops, by the police, and it made a huge impression on him. How what happened here, and this is what he says. I found myself unwilling in the center of it. Before me, I saw the coffin covered in red carnations sway dangerously on the shoulders of pallbearers. I saw horses go mad, sticks and lances clash. It seemed to me that the corpse could have fallen to the ground at any moment and the horses would have trampled it. Deeply struck, as soon as I got home, I did a drawing of what I had seen. And so this is the drawing that he does. And you look at this makes complete sense to most of us, right? This looks like something that we can analyze and think about. It's very, very clear. You see this, and we're not sure what we're looking at. And it really takes time to go from here, where everything is delineated very, very clearly, to here, where we're not sure what we're thinking about or what we're looking about or what we're sensing. And again, think of what I said earlier about diagonal lines and how they create movement and chaos. Look at all the diagonals that are in this. Not only that, he starts to get circular movements within this work. Look at these movements, circular, circular, circular. It's as though he's trying to recreate an eddy or a whirlpool in front of us. And of course, what does he have front and center is the anarchist's coffin, which is draped in red. And so it really brings us all to the center. And I just love how he adds this very, very deep blue here. It looks like this is a tower that's toppling or something like that. You can see the energy of the movement. This is a policeman's truncheon that's being brought down onto someone. You see all that action that he's trying to recreate. Now, again, I've talked about how these artists really tried to deny the past. But, if you look at this and you look at Uccello's Battle of San Romano, you've got a horse front and center, just like you do in this painting. You've got all these pikes and lances that are sticking up here. You've got sort of the same idea that he's trying to recreate. Again, it's hard to erase these memories of things that you would have seen, at that time in Europe in art school. And here's another example is Giotto. I mean, God, you can't get more traditional than Giotto. Here's the arrest of Christ. And here's Giotto trying to show this anarchic scene. And what is he doing? Look at all these diagonals that he's using within this painting. So it's really hard to look at this and not think of this, the influence that Giotto and Uccello would have had on these modernist painters. So yes, they wanted to destroy the museums, burn down the libraries, but at the same time, let's just borrow a little piece of it for this scene. The last of the futurists I'm going to talk about is Gino Severini, and he was kind of an interesting character. He got expelled at school when he was 15 because he stole a bunch of exams. He got placed into an art school by a patron who recognized his talent, and said, "Wow, I'm going to front your money to art school." But then he withdrew the support after 2 years. And the comment of the patron was, "I have absolutely no understanding of your lack of order." Because that's the direction that they were headed in. And he met Boccioni in 1900, and both Boccioni and Severini were taught by Balla, right? So they were both students at. But I want you to look at this self-portrait that he does in 2009. Look at it carefully. Look at what he's doing 3 years later. Right. And by that time, he had moved to Paris in 1906, and he was completely entrenched in the avant-garde of artists that were working at the time. And he's the one who really showed what Cubism was all about to the other futurists. Later on, after World War One, he ended up abandoning Futurism and doing much more sort of traditional art, if you will. But I wanted to just show you a couple of his works. This is another work that's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and this is a large piece. It's really something that I spent a long time staring at because I thought it was fascinating. So it's the dynamic hieroglyphic of the Bal Tabaran, and the Bal Tabaran was a club, a nightclub in Paris. And if you just take a moment, at first it's hard to figure out what you're looking at. It's really, really scattershot. But if you spend some time with it, here's the head of the dancer, and against like a cubist might do, you don't really see the head in full form. Here's an arm, here's the top of her dress, here are these little petticoats that are under her dress, and she's dancing and kicking up. But again, think about what Braque and Picasso were doing. He's putting words in here. So here we have valse here, which is the French word for waltz. And then let's see somewhere. It always takes me a minute to find the other. There's polka somewhere vertically. Uh,
Upper left corner.
Upper left corner. Let me do this.
And polka is to the right, to the left.
Yeah. Oh, there it is right there.
Yeah.
And you can see, how it's completely broken up and there's just lots of movement and action in this painting. I think this is just a wonderful painting. It really, again, you can sort of imagine the cacophony of what's going on in this nightclub. So you're there, and here do you see this person who's sitting there with a monocle and a top hat, sort of enjoying the dance that's going on. You can hear it, you can feel it, you really sense it. He's really trying to get our other senses working while we're looking at this painting. And I wanted to just show you a comparison piece. This is by Sonia Delaunay, who was the orifice that I talked about earlier. This is a massive piece. This is in the Pompidou, the Centre Pompidou in Paris. This is one of my favorite works of art. It's so huge and encompassing. It's hard to get a sense when you're looking at a slide of just how immense this is and how you're just put into this painting. And here you can see all these little couples that are dancing along, and she's doing it in a very different way than Severini is doing, but it's the same idea. They're both trying to recreate what the atmosphere of a dance or a ball would be. And these are both clubs that were very, very popular, that both of them used to go to. Both Delaunay and Severini used to go to these clubs to dance at them, so it was something that they were very familiar with. But you can see with the Orphists how they're using color, and they're sort of borrowing some of the ideas of the Cubists as well. You can see how the Futurists really took that to the next level and really, imagine just shattering a mirror to the floor. And then you look at all the shards and you'd be able to sort of see what's on the ceiling. If you had a really bright ceiling, you'd be able to see all these different shards. But eventually, if you stare long enough, you get to put those shards back in together to something that your mind can sort of grab onto. So, as I said, these are people that you might not necessarily like. So, this is the type of image that they also really liked to do, which was war image and war heraldry and, sort of this push towards that as a way to cleanse society. And what he's doing here is, again, he's using words just like Marinetti might have done in his poem. He's using a visual image of these cannoneers with this cannon going off, and he's putting these words in it. And of course, these are French words, so you can see that he's using onomatopoeia, just like Marinetti might do, right? Boom, right? And here's courbe graduelle vers la terre. So the gradual curve towards earth, towards the ground, right? So you get this idea that you see the movement of the cannonball in this arc across the sky. And this is done in a glorification of war. Here's the next one that's also the armored train. If you remove these rifles from and the cannon from this painting, it's kind of an interesting cubist modernist painting, but It's a glorification of war. That's what it is. So that's why these guys are really, it's hard to love them because they really were not pleasant people. And then this is again, this idea of trying to get movement. So spherical expansion of light, centripetal and centrifugal. So just a quick physics lesson, if you've got a bucket of water that you're holding and you start to swing it around, right, around your head, the water doesn't fall down on you, right? So that's the centrifugal force that keeps the water from falling downward. The centripetal force is the force that your arm is doing as it's moving that as it's moving that bucket around. So what Severini is trying to do here, he's trying to get you to think by using that title. He's trying to get you to think about movement, how those contrasting movements work. And you can see here a lot of different, let me see if I, no, a lot of interplay between all those lines. And of course, lots of diagonals, lots of all those things that we talked about in the beginning, right? Here, it's almost pointless the way he's doing this. Everyone see that? Then it's almost Orphist at the way that he's using all these different colors. And it's clearly influenced by Cubism, by the fact that, we've got something that's sort of shattered in the way that it's created and then tried to put it back together. And then think of the way he's using light. So it's impressionist in some ways. So, this is really a recap of everything that we've talked about the types of influences that they had on their work. So, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. So I want to just give you a quick recap. Futurists actually extended. I really sort of concentrated on the early futurists. They really extended onto, to World War II and were in direct contact with Mussolini and pushing Mussolini's agenda. So again, started by the poet Marinetti. I showed you that book that's full of onomatopoeia, the idea of rejection of the old, the welcoming of the new, speed, movement, power, machinery. And this Rousselot is exactly what I'm talking about. What does it show? It shows this motorcycle that seems to be going through Mach 1. It's as though you can see the planes of energy that are coming off of this motorcycle. And this idea that they wanted war to get rid of the old, to cleanse the old, to have a renaissance of art in their own terms, and their strong links to fascism in Italy. So that's futurism in a nutshell.
So I got a question, Charlie.
Please.
Um, what would be maybe some futurist works that we can see here in San Francisco that you particularly like?
Hard to say. There's a lot in New York. But I'm trying to think if there are any at SF MoMA. Um, None of it is up. Let's put it that way. They may own some futurist work, but in the time that we were working there, I don't think I ever saw any futurist work, which is a shame. I mean, it's loaded. It's loaded. It's a loaded topic, right? I mean, it's a topic that, when you talk about artists, being problematic, wow, these guys were problematic. But again, something I repeat often is that, if museums were only filled with nice people, museums would be empty. You
Yeah,
just
I like Wagner. I don't like him as a person, but I
right,
love his
right.
music.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on and on and on with that. I mean, it's just, you can really think about a lot of artists that you really don't like as artists, but you can't deny that their talent is incredible, and you can't deny that they bring something to your soul that was not there before. Picasso, not an easy person to like, and yet in my mind, he's the most influential artist of the 20th century. I'm not saying he's one of my favorite artists of the 20th century. I'm saying he's one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. But, nice guy? Probably not. I mean, Dali was a fascist bootlicker in his time. He cozied up to the fascist regime, and you know, uh, it, sometimes it colors the way you look at art, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can sort of dismiss it as another time period or something like that. It's, you know, it's hard to completely love an artist knowing their full history because think of why people go into art. They're working through their own traumatic issues, and so that's there's books written about that, which we're not going to have time to discuss here, obviously.
I got some comments. First of all, a couple people. Great presentation, Charlie. Excellent
Thank
presentation
you.
from Kathy and Kevin. Thank you for those comments. Gail says, I really do not like modern art, so I was thinking of not attending today's talk,
Ah,
but I like Charlie's insights and decided to be open to something I'm not comfortable
yeah.
with. Thank goodness I did because I love these paintings, which I guess means I love the Futurists. Ha! Never heard of any of these artists or the movement itself. Thank you, Charlie, Rodney, and the Community Living Campaign for expanding my horizons yet again. Well, thank you, Gail. We always like hearing that.
Yeah. And Gail, you're right. I completely understand why you don't like modern art. I get it and I roll with it. I think that there's something very comforting about looking at realism in art. There's something recognizable. Uh, and I'm not saying this in a put down way at all. I mean, some of my favorite artists are realists. For me, Vermeer is in the pantheon. I look at Vermeer and I think he captures something no other painter captures, and so, I understand completely where you're coming from. There's a lot of great modern art, and it's a bit of a journey. You have to take a bit of a leap in order to enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think it's our job to kind of make it fun. This isn't eating your vegetables. You shouldn't be looking at stuff, feeling like they're not. If you're confused by it, you shouldn't feel bad about that.
Yeah.
But maybe in conversation we can all like mine it for interesting stuff.
Yeah.
So Charlie, thank you very much for this presentation.
You're welcome.
And just always love doing these programs with you. So great having you
Likewise.
on Art Doing Adventures.
Oh, I'm reading
I
this comment by Gail about there's a person in a book called The Clockmaker of Filigree Street that has synesthesia. Yeah, it's such a fascinating idea.
Yeah. Do you think would you like to have synesthesia, Charlie? Do you think it's a good thing to have?
Well, it's really, really interesting. I think there are pluses and minuses. It's kind of like there's a really famous person in history who was known to have a brilliant memory. He used to do these memory shows where he would look at people's licenses before the show, 2,000 people in a room, and he could literally pick out, what it was. And one of the ways that he did this is he would form like a synesthesia moment. He would go through all his different senses to help him remember all these different sights. And he used to talk how it was both, a gift and a burden. Like, for example, he couldn't get out of that, So depending on how deep your synesthesia was, it would be a problem. But I think if probably in this group that are listening, there might be a person that has synesthesia, and for most people, it's not a problem at all. If you're Berlioz, you compose a symphony about what you're seeing. Kandinsky had synesthesia, and he created works of art based on other senses that were involved.
Right. Well, thanks, Charlie. I think I'll wrap things up. We'll be back in 2 weeks with Avril and Javine and another great program. So everybody be well. See you
Oh,
soon.
just to
Yeah.
Ronald's comment, yes, Picasso's piece Guernica is absolutely anti-fascist. In fact, there's just a great story that I have to tell where the Germans, Picasso was living in Paris and the Germans came and were tearing up his apartment, who knows why, just to harass him. And the German officer saw a postcard of Guernica sitting on the table. And the German officer looked at Picasso and said, "Did you do this?" And Picasso looked at him in the eye and said, "No, you did."
Ah, great story.
Yeah.
All right. See everybody soon. Be well.
Thank
Thanks
Take
again,
care.
you.
Charlie.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gail.